I like to think that we're in a bit of a golden age for games right now. I'm sure someone out there will consider that an inflammatory statement, and they'll have a whole 30 minutes on how some big studio has personally offended them and shot their dog and stole their kneecaps, thereby ruining the entire concept of the modern games industry. But if you take a step back from those talking heads that say too much and know too little, I don't actually know how I would disagree with that statement. In the past few years, I feel like we've seen games as an art form reach entirely new heights. The modern God of War series has shown that even the most basic hack-and-slash titles, with the correct minds behind them, can be transformed into incredible narratives surrounding the love of families and the breaking of cycles. Red Dead Redemption 2 showcases one of the best exposures to the notion of limited time and doing what you can with that limited time. And Baldur's Gate 3 is hands down the most expansive game and story I've ever encountered, a title that basically swings as hard as it can at everything it wants to be and succeeds in every regard. More than that though, we're seeing games that are lasting longer and longer. Titles like Skyrim, a 13-year-old game held aloft and alive by the love of its community, or a game like Stardew Valley, 8 years old and kept thriving in no small part by the dedication and drive of its own creator, who insists on expanding what was a finished game with incredible content even years later, and doing it all for free. Here's a wild one. We've been casually and not so casually enjoying old-school RuneScape for longer than RuneScape 2, the game that OSRS started as a copy of, for longer than RuneScape 2 was a thing. But it's not just that these titans of the industry are coming to bear, or that the titles we loved in our youth are standing the test of time, or that these games are becoming a leading way of telling stories that really matter. It's that all of those things can be true, but they don't always have to be. I think what makes this a golden age, at least for me and my relationship with games, is that there's still so much fun to be had just for the sake of fun. There is a full, massive spectrum to be enjoyed here, because just as much as games are being made today to push the medium and art form, there are games being made just to be fun with nothing else planned at all. Games with two beautiful, shining eyes, and not a single thought going on behind them. And I think Evil West is maybe the best example I've seen of this yet. Evil West is a beautiful three-part mashup recipe made up of the combat and camera of the modern God of War, the setting and aesthetic of the Red Dead duology, and the story and genre of Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter. You're familiar with that third one, right? It literally doesn't matter. Let me play you the opening lines of the game.
Since the time of the Founding Fathers, dark forces have been preying on America. As the fight against these vampires continued, a secret organization has trained people with remarkable skills. The agent's duty is to protect ordinary people from the forces of evil.
I literally, okay, you don't understand. There's already so many things to say. 1. This game is not narrated. I do not know who this man is. He will never speak another line. It is an absolutely cracked call to have the opening line of your game be narrated and then never use that technique again. 2. Something about the way that they established the concept of vampires within the game's setting absolutely Dungeons My Dragons. The first line builds this tone of mystery, intrigue, dark forces preying on settlers. What could it be? Vampires. That's it. It's vampires. It's just vampires. Mystery solved. 3. I tend to play with subtitles on, just a preference I have, but it absolutely kills me that the narrator is subtitled here, because all the narrator is doing is reading the words already on the screen, so you're getting the same lines twice, except if you look close, there's actually small differences and discrepancies between the two different texts. 4. This does nothing to set up anything about the actual story or events of the game. It's just a handful of incredibly open-ended lines about recent history. So when you suddenly jump into the first cutscene of the game, you'll still have no context for what's going on. It's only been 4 sentences, but Evil West has already planted its massive flag firmly in the Dust Bowl dirt of the American West, and that flag proudly proclaims that this is going to be a silly one. And oh my god, the first cutscene just keeps this ball rolling. Who are these two? Who is Chester? Why is he on this train? I cannot stress enough that capturing this Chester fella alive seems to be very important, but then this Jesse character sets enough explosives on the most catastrophic if exploded part of the track to make Harry Truman blush. And then, when that explosions-based catastrophe does in fact come to fruition, both of these characters seem shocked I tell you, by the fact that a train running on rails through this canyon, falls into the canyon once the track is exploded. Well, time to go find Chester. I'm sure he's fine. And if he's not, vampires already travel in coffins. As we walk, I should probably establish my own tone here for this essay. Evil West is a level-based game with a total of 16 playable levels, and we're not going to talk about a lot of them in detail because a lot of them don't really matter all that much. What I mean by that is that most of these levels are just excuses to punch vampires in the face because all Evil West really wants to do is let you punch vampires in the face. Evil West is not a game overly concerned with the definitions for humanity or the value of human togetherness. It's not an exploration of the ethical use of themes. It's about punching vampires in the face. And a game really only needs to do one or two things well to be an experience worth having. Evil West cannot say that it has great polish, or great voice acting, or great dialogue, or great storytelling, but it doesn't really need any of that, and honestly, I don't think it really cared about trying to have any of that. Evil West is a game about punching vampires in the face until they are dead. And to put it simply, it is the best game about punching vampires in the face until they are dead that I have ever seen. It is also a game that is remarkably, beautifully, endearingly scuffed. There is some serious jank in this game, but because the game does such a good job nailing what it wants to be, a vampire face-punching simulator, all of those rough edges end up feeling incredibly charming, and I am so excited to tell you about the highlights of my journey through this game. First of all, Evil West is an unexpectedly pretty game. This is one of the things that Evil West does really well, and despite my early thought that this was a game made in Unreal Engine 5, it's actually made with a previous generation of Unreal 4. Now, I don't really know enough about game design to speak to the full difference between those two models, but I've seen enough projects made in Unreal 5 that do not look anywhere near as good as Evil West does to know this is probably one of those instances where an art or a design team has pushed incredibly hard to get a result like this, and I think that effort really shows. The use of light is particularly phenomenal when it does get the chance to shine, which, when you're making a game about vampires, is always a thing you want to look towards. More than that, however, more than once I found myself entirely captivated by the skybox or landscape of my current locale, and that feels like an incredible treat. The real star of the Evil West show is its combat, and if the locales were not designed well, that would be its own thing. But if the skybox of this level wasn't a stunning borealis, I wouldn't have ever pinned that it could be. It's just very cool to see a thing like this, so much attention given to visual details that would typically be secondary or tertiary design elements for this style of game. With that said, the mechanics to combat really is where this game shines. The star of the show, of course, is punching a vampire in the face, but that mechanic co-stars with a lot of other options. The combat in Evil West is, in the simplest term, one of the most expansive and engaging systems for combat I've ever put my hands on. It has a real sort of Path of Exile effect to it, where you start off by doing a single thing, and then a second thing gets mixed in, and then you explore and expand, and suddenly, by the end of the game, you're flicking and dancing through all of these different options, and you know exactly how to best use each of those options and which ones you enjoy most because they were all introduced with correct time and pacing. You start off with just that most simple punch, but even the punch doesn't stay simple for long. We're taught how to do the punch, but then also how to do a knock-up punch, a hero punch, and even a cannonball punch, which, as a side note, listen to how good the sound design is here. That sounds like something called a cannonball punch, and this same level of care is given to basically every single element of combat in the game. Later on in this first level is when you acquire your revolver, giving you access to some range capabilities, but the game will not be satisfied with your arsenal until you're switching between your fists, your revolver, your repeater, your crossbow, your flamethrower, your explosive charges, your Gatling gun. By God, there are so many different weapons in this game. And while this might sound like an incredibly overwhelming amount of options, mostly because it kind of is, Evil West's myriad options for warfare fall into this perfect, beautiful collection where things are introduced sparingly at the correct moments and with enough space between them so as to not overwhelm the player with too many new tools at once. At the same time, however, you do not need to master every single one of these tools. There is unique value to each, but that value often has crossover, meaning that if you forget about the crossbow, you're not going to be losing out on this invaluable asset that you can't beat the game without. It's also probably worth talking about the enemies as well, because the design of these bad guys is super unique to Evil West. Vampires are pretty well understood as monsters, but when it comes to writing, we also really tend to use them as this sort of high-class beauty. Vampires can be monstrous, but they're often attached in some way to this sort of effortless, timeless attraction. So when your first enemy is an emaciated husk covered in leeches, that is a bit of a turn. Your classic pretty boy vampire is still represented here, don't worry, and we'll talk about them in a moment, but all of the chaff-style mobs are pretty scrungly, and they've been, as I like to call the process, Wild Westified. Mobs are covered in leather jackets, or they're wrapped up in chains or pierced through with railroad spikes. A fun element that wasn't really needed but exists anyways is that every monster in the game also comes with its own lore tab so you can know as much as possible about your enemies. And this is where my first hold-up with the game came from. The first real enemy of note that we're given the chance to dance with is the Genu Giant. They're used to teach us about timing and rhythm in Evil West, and also how to interrupt certain enemies' actions. And if you check the lore tab, you'll see that these giants are described as cannibalistic predators from the Genu tribe of North America. Pause. In a vacuum, this kind of thing isn't really of note, except nothing exists in a vacuum and context always matters. And in a sort of Wild West gunslinger cowboy game, having your enemies be monstrous predators that are also attached to American Indian tribes means you run the risk of your story being this metaphor for the righteous white man clearing out the feral savages to make the land right for the civilized American, which isn't my kind of story exactly. That said, by the time I saw this, I still had basically all of Steam's 2-hour refund policy to play with, so I kept pushing forward, and I'm glad that I did, because we found Chester, who is a vampire transporting some catering for a vampire party. And in doing so, we got ourselves a new lead, and in turn, we discovered the true villain of the game, the Italians. I know I said that Evil West doesn't really have a great story, but it's honestly got a perfectly decent one, and we should talk about that. Peter D'Abano is a middling member of the Sanguisuge, a hierarchy of vampires from the Old World and Europe, and in general, it's these guys that are going to be our main villains. It's these guys that are the aforementioned dark forces preying on America. And suddenly, that newfound context potentially leads down the path of understanding that they're not just preying on America as in the United States of, but America as a continent. In this sense, you could look at Evil West as a metaphor for old world Europeans preying on every aspect of the new world possible, but I don't think the game wants to be that complicated because, you know. D'Abano says that while humans were once easy prey, our advances in science continue to bring us closer and closer to supremacy, and once we have that, it won't be long until we've hunted all vampires to extinction. And the game actually goes pretty hard into showing that D'Abano is correct. In this level, we needed Chester's help to break through a glamour, a piece of vampire illusion magic that they've used for centuries to keep themselves hidden and safe, but later in the game, thanks to the advances in the relevant sciences, the Rentier Institute, we'll get to them, hold tight, are able to produce a piece of technology capable of breaking through those glamours with no assistance from a vampire. In short, the time of the old world vampire is limited. The age of man is coming for them. Of course, the old world vampires do not like this message from D'Abano, because if they were to accept that change was needed, it would mean that they are wrong, and that's the sort of thing that these groups struggle to deal with. It is far easier for them to pretend that they are in control than it is for them to actually be in control. Throughout the course of the game, you'll mostly be working to shut down these new world vampires, using your newfangled technology to hunt down the leeches and ticks that have been preying on humans since we first walked out of our caves. This is the end goal of the Rentier Institute, the agency that Jesse and Edgar work with. The Institute aims to harness the powers of progress to safeguard mankind, and the only problem is one James Harrow, who is a complete and total piece of shit and also the Assistant Secretary of War. Later on in the game, it's revealed that Harrow is much more interested in lining his own pockets than actually aiding his nation, which actually does a really interesting thing for the story. You see, between the Rentier Institute and the New World Vampires, the game focuses a great deal on this fight between two different progressive ideologies, both held back by different elements. The New World Vampires are restrained by the Old World Vampires' conservative nature, while the Rentier Institute is restrained by government corruption and bureaucracy. Both of these main factions are inherently progressive, one aligned with the growth and capabilities of technology, and the other in a more cultural sense, with the idea that old world vampire norms do not make sense in a new world context. The game goes very hard in this notion, with the story's main villain, Felicity D'Abano, having the core ideology that the only two true options in life are adaptation or death. Speaking of death, you guys want to kill a highborn vampire? Looking back at this very first boss fight, I'm filled with a renewed appreciation for how well put together the combat of this game is, because while my first fight with a highborn vampire looks sloppy, unsteady, admittedly perhaps a bit nervous, my final fight with a highborn vampire looks like this. It is very cool to see how quickly I got comfortable with the mechanics of the game and how quickly I decided which of the combat methods I got the most value out of. I mean, here in this first fight, you can even see that I'm not understanding that these little gems dropped by bosses are health orbs that I can pick up, but by the final fight, I'm specifically taking damage in certain places so that I can pick them up, because I took an earlier upgrade that allows health orbs to also charge up my lightning gear, which is great if you want to do this. And since we've jumped so deep into the end of the game all of a sudden, I also want to mention that this game does one of my favorite things for showcasing your growth, which is that it will take a thing that was a boss and start using them as mini-bosses or even just generic enemies. I personally find it really fun to have a sort of stable benchmark to show how much stronger I've become and how fluent I've grown in the game's mechanics. This first boss fight feels like it's where the game's tutorial really ends. Every new mechanic beyond this encounter is going to build. There is no more foundation to be laid. The highborn vampire bosses have decent health, do decent damage, and have something akin to 2 different attacks, both relatively telegraphed, so that the fight is really the game getting its chance to show off what the game will expect from you, and in the largest sense, it's going to ask you to be able to split your focus. There's a bit here where I'm kiting about some minor infected, but Deabano goes into this vulnerable hover mode, and the game highlights that with these targeting circles, so you need to switch from clearing out little guys to putting rounds on target to stop the hover, and then focus back to the little guys. This target prioritization ended up being the most important part of combat in Evil West. There's really only 12 or 13 different types of enemies that you'll see repeated, which might sound like a lot, but you'll very quickly develop a sense for and an immediate reaction to the ones that you find most dangerous, the ones that have to go first, and that will gradually extend until you have an exact but unspoken checklist for the order in which you focus down each type of enemy. It was after this fight, though, that I really got a read on what this game was. This is the only time I'm going to do this, but I want to play you this entire cutscene, unedited, in full. Because if you haven't played Evil West, you need this context. And if you have played Evil West, you need a reminder.
Think you could have brought a bigger knife?
Some people get a gold watch when they retire. I got Susan here.
Should have asked him how to get out of here.
Too late. He won't be of any use for a month or 2. Wait. What about Chester?
Well, what are you gonna do?
Now that is how you shape an explosion. Damn, we're late.
Yeah, at least we won't be going back to the manor empty-handed.
When I say that this game has scuff, this is what I'm talking about. The cutscene starts instantly, with no fade or buildup, just an immediate interruption. The camera POV puts us in the seat of Deabano, which is clever, but if you listen to the sound, it seems that Edgar cuts off Deabano's head with a flurry of stabs rather than a slice, which is funny. Edgar and Jesse realize that they should have asked for directions out first, despite the way they came in working just fine, only for Edgar to say, "Wait, what about Chester?" followed by, "What are you gonna do?" only for the scene to instantly hard cut to a comically large explosion sinking the entire town above the temple, implying that they left Chester behind to die in the explosion, except you work with Chester later in the game, meaning that he was totally fine? Also, Deabano's head is just sitting in bright sunlight, which Edgar even calls out is very bad for vampires' delicate skin. And above all of this, there's just this general tone that every spoken line of dialogue in the game feels like it was a first take, with no context or direction given to the vocal talent. And when the cutscene ends, in between the scene and the loading screen, the game always displays a single frame of gameplay right in between the two. It is just so silly. But because the one thing the game wants to be good at is in fact very good, that scuff becomes very endearing. You know, there's this thing I've been thinking about ever since I watched Nakey Jakey's video on the defense of the 7 out of 10 game. I'm going to assign you his video as homework, please go watch it, but the basic idea is that not every game needs to be a genre-defining masterpiece. By definition, they can't all be genre-defining masterpieces. Some things need to exist just to be fun and silly, and they don't need to be taken so seriously. And the reason that that's sitting in my mind right now is because Evil West is sitting comfortably at 74% here on Steam. And honestly, I think that's a perfectly fair score, but the problem is, I worry that some people see 74% and they assume a game is trash. And I worry that people like me sometimes help support that notion via exclusion. When you're in a position like mine, it is very easy, I think, to only want to focus on the biggest things, the games and titles that have the most weight behind them, because there's often a correlation between well-known, beloved, well-polished titles and a larger engagement by your audience, and I enjoy that engagement, I do. I mean, by God, I did theater from kindergarten through college. I love being on a stage with an audience. But Evil West has been this great reminder that a game doesn't need to be this generation-defining masterpiece to be good, to be fun, to be worth your time. And I feel like there is this sort of responsibility to this platform you all have given me where I need to appreciate these sorts of games too, not just the big titles that define a genre. I mean, I still have different Skyrim and Baldur's Gate 3 videos in the planning stage. We're still going to revisit Cyberpunk 2077 and Night City coming up here sometime, but man, I'm realizing that sometimes I just want to make a 15 or 20 minute video on a silly thing I enjoyed a lot. So here we are. God, Evil West was fun. You should play it. Try and get it on sale. This has been a new chance for me to talk about things that I enjoyed just for them being fun. And I still have plans for bigger videos on larger titles, deeper, emotionally introspective things, so don't worry if that's what you enjoy, but you might just see some more stuff like this going forward. Which is cool, I think, because way more people ended up knowing this game and being excited for the concept of this video than I would have ever expected. I'm going to be doing a companion video for this one over on Patreon that's a little bit more of a full story breakdown and highlighting all of my favorite silly bits from the game. More than that though, patrons got access to this video, and all of my videos, early and ad-free. I'm incredibly grateful for their support, and this is always my chance to thank them, with an extra special thanks to Daddy Biscuit22 and Fortuna the Witch for their incredibly generous custom pledges. If any of that sounds neat to you, then consider heading over to my Patreon page and seeing if there's a spot with your name on it. Thank you.